Good evening and welcome to Freedom is a Constant Struggle with your host Kiilu Nyasha, engineer Stephen Leader, and our very special guest is Jennifer Friedenbach, Executive Director of the Coalition on Homelessness here in San Francisco. Originally from Redwood City, Jennifer has worked about 18 years on homeless and poverty issues, including welfare rights, housing, homeless prevention, health care, disability, and human and civil rights. For 5 years, Jennifer worked at San Mateo County's Hunger and Homeless Action Coalition, moving from administrative assistant to director. She started work in San Francisco 13 years ago with the coalition. Jennifer has co-authored a number of reports, including Locked Out, The Voices of People with Mental Illness, a 1999 study citing bureaucratic blockage of access to San Francisco's mental health system for people in crisis. Housing First for Families, another report which documents the impact of homelessness on children, and Shelter Shocked, which presents a statistical study of human rights abuses in San Francisco's shelter system. Jennifer sits on the Implementation Council for the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness and was a founding member of the People's Budget Collaborative, which redirects city funding toward supporting poor people's programs in San Francisco. Last year, Jennifer was among 11 San Franciscans honored with Women Making History Award. Welcome, Jennifer. It's so good to have you back here on SF Live.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And Jennifer, why don't we start right off with talking about the dramatic increase in homelessness that has to have happened since the economic crash.
Yeah, San Francisco has definitely been impacted by the recession in terms of homelessness. I think probably based on the data, families have been hit the hardest. Our shelters in San Francisco have had more than a doubling of the wait list for shelter. And actually, families in San Francisco that are in a housing crisis are facing more than a 6-month wait for shelter. And we have a pretty similar situation, although not as dramatic, for folks who don't have minor children. And our resource centers have seen about a 50% increase in people coming in. And most of those folks are newly homeless people. And so what we have with the economic crises is, of course, poor folks who are just barely making rent, and then maybe they lose a couple hours of work, or maybe they lose their job, and they don't have the accumulated wealth to maintain their housing and end up losing it and become homeless. And San Francisco has definitely been feeling the impact.
Right, and homelessness is being caused not just by the unemployment skyrocketing and people being unable to pay rent, but also due to the skyrocketing number of foreclosures. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there has been, yeah, of course. I mean, people have been reading that a lot in the media, and people who have been homeowners that are losing their houses. There was a lot of really shady real estate happening where people were getting very bad loans. That the assumption was from the banks is that the property values would rise, and that people could end up getting these mortgages. But then, of course, when the property values dip back down, it just doesn't work out for folks. And then as they lose their income, they are ending up not able to take out second mortgages on their home, etc., and cover up the mortgage. And it's just been a total disaster. We don't see a whole lot of people immediately who lose their homes becoming homeless. I mean, generally homeowners tend to have a lot more accumulated wealth, and so it ends up being a step-down process. I mean, one of the things to remember about homelessness is homeless folks are really no different from other poor folks, in that people who are poor who have housing, the only difference is from them who are poor who don't have housing is whether or not they have a housing subsidy. And so for people who are homeowners, it's not quite as an immediate effect, but eventually it'll happen as people's savings accounts run out, etc.
And speaking of subsidized housing, let's talk a little bit about that. as we mentioned before the show, HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, is being run as a criminal enterprise. I mean, it's so completely corrupt. So billions and billions of dollars have just kind of disappeared. And talk a little bit about HUD and subsidized housing, how prisoners, for example, who have done their time and, so paid their dues, come out and do not qualify for subsidized housing. So often they're left out in the cold.
Yeah. I mean, historically, just to kind of take it a couple steps back, when you look at the original causes of homelessness, I mean, in the early 1980s, we had a huge number of people who, millions of men, women, and children across the United States who had become homeless. And so I think kind of the common thought of that today is that it's almost as if a million people decided, wouldn't it be cool to live outside? And there's this complete denial of the structural causes of homelessness. And a big part of it is that we completely gutted federal funding for subsidized housing and gutted it by about 74%. Now, that started under Jimmy Carter, which might surprise some folks, in 1978. Took a huge nosedive, and then under Reagan, of course, it went way down until 1983. At its lowest point is when our very first homeless shelter opened up here in San Francisco. And since then, we've pretty much flatlined it. Instead of addressing the systemic causes of homelessness, we've kind of tinkered around the edges, kind of had an emergency response, but really didn't get at that systemic cause, which, was primarily the lack of funding with housing, but that also intersected with a couple other things. I mean, we had an economic system that went towards a service sector economy, where people were earning lower wages, who were unskilled. All those union jobs were lost. Didn't have health insurance. Were
outsourced mostly.
Exactly. We gutted our mental health treatment system, and we had a whole lot of people who lost then in that perspective. And then we've slowly cut away at our social safety net. So whether it's disability, public assistance, unemployment insurance, none of that is kept up with the inflation, and neither has wages. And so those forces really intersected to create this huge crisis around homelessness. What we have today in San Francisco is the result of that. We have thousands and thousands of people who are without housing, many of them working, many of them living in very precarious housing situations that we don't kind of think about in terms of homelessness, not sort of the stereotype person standing on the street corner who you can just look at and kind of assume what their housing status is. But we're talking about families with children, we're talking about working class people, all of whom are without housing.
And as I understand it, about a third of the homeless people, and I think this is a nationwide figure,